Good to be with you once again as we continue our study on the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And as always, we're going to be building on what has happened before. We started off by really making the case for the indispensability of historicity for Christianity. And that's really a unique thing for the biblical faith, that all other religions, historicity is a side issue that really doesn't impinge specifically upon them. But for Christianity, it is front and central. If Christianity is not historic, if it's not based on actual events that took place with actual people in actual places that exist, then Christianity is nothing. The historicity of the resurrection and everything surrounding that is of the highest importance. We also established that really when you listen to the critical scholars, even up to today, that there is a general understanding that, or a general agreement amongst the majority, that the tomb was empty. And so you have some means that you have to have in order to explain why was the tomb empty. So today we continue our discussion by getting into some related topics. But before we do that, let's join together in morning prayer. Let us pray. I thank you, my heavenly Father, through Jesus Christ, your dear Son, that you have kept me this night from all harm and danger. And I pray that you would keep me this day also from sin and every evil, that all my doings in life may please you. For into your hands I commend myself, my body and soul and all things. Let your holy angel be with me, that the evil foe may have no power over me. Amen. As always, I will invite you to send any questions or comments that you have on today's study or on any other study. You can do that by emailing me, pastor@villagelutheranchurch.org. I do have one thing that has come in recently that I wanted to address, and that was, hey, Pastor, where do I find all this information that you're setting forth? Or, Pastor, where did you dig it all up from? Now, I will admit most of this is just stuff that has accumulated for me over the last 25 plus years of reading and such. It comes from a variety of different books, articles out of scholarly magazines and such. So there are a lot of good books that are out there that you can utilize. And to be honest, with the various books that are out there that deal with the historical evidence for the biblical faith, they largely say the exact same things, though they may give a slightly unique spin on it, coming from a little bit different angle. And it's really, I'm not saying anything really that hasn't been said before. And that might be the strongest point for what I have to say, is that I'm not making anything up. I'm not coming up with something new. I am simply stating what others, historians, both Christian, non-Christian, those who are sympathetic to the biblical record, those who are critical of the biblical record, what they themselves have recognized already. So a lot of good books out there, and all of them will have a portion at least of what I am talking about. If you want to have a specific area that you want to look into, let me know, and I will point you in the right direction for what books are most helpful in that regard. But also in this general topic, if you want to listen a little bit more, I would invite you to go to villagelectures.com. That is the website for our lecture series that we have had over the past number of years. And we've had two different speakers who really grappled with the topic of Christian apologetics. That's not us apologizing for the Christian faith, but apologia as in this Greek word that really means a defense. So it's a defense, giving an answer for what the Christian faith holds and why that is historically reasonable and such. There are two specific individuals in our lecture series, and if you go to villagelectures.com, you can find a video of their lectures where you can hear them talking on it. One of them would be Craig Parton. On October the 3rd of 2015, he spoke, and here at Village, and you'll see him really taking this up as an attorney. He himself is an attorney. One of the good books you might want to pick up is his book from Concordia Publishing House entitled The Defense Never Rests, and he'll set forth a lot of very similar things as to what I'm talking about in this series. You could also go to the November 8th, 2014 lecture by John Warwick Montgomery, who is really in many ways the teacher who taught Craig Parton and many others the basics of Christian apologetics. And Dr. Montgomery's presentation will also be quite helpful for you. So today, let's talk about, and I got into this the last time a little bit, kind of foreshadowing. We're going to be talking about the criteria for the reliability of historical witnesses and how that follows through in our accounts of the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, really from our 4 gospel accounts. And here are the 4 things we would look for, and I want you to think about this as being in a court of law. This is along the lines of Craig Parton that I just mentioned. The way that he would go about this is when you have witnesses in a court of law, what are some of the things that you are looking for? And one of the first things would be some first-hand testimony. And that really gets into the issue of how do we date the gospel accounts? How do we date the New Testament? And are these texts that have actually been written within a close time period of the events that they say that they are recording? A second one would be, do you have corroborating testimony? If you only have one person saying it, then you have the possibility that that person is not completely accurate. Maybe also they're just mistaken. Maybe they had delusions, etc. So you're always looking for corroborating testimony where there's substantiation from yet another person. Also, when you're looking at that corroboration, you're looking for individuals who are saying complementary things, but they're not saying the exact same thing. Because if you're saying the exact same thing, think about that in a court of law. One witness gives testimony, the next witness gives the exact same testimony, almost word for word, and immediately you're thinking, I think there's some collusion going on here, that they have coached each other about exactly what they're going to say. So the corroborating testimony is its most strong. It is its strongest when the 2 individuals, or in our case, the 4 accounts of the gospel, are complementary, that they don't clash with each other, but yet they're a little bit different than each other because they're each giving a slightly different angle on the account. The third issue that we'd want to look at is the evidence of manuscript integrity. So, is the manuscript of a given account, let's say Matthew's account of things, is there a changing story? So this witness, Matthew, that at one time he says A and the next time he says B, or is there consistency specifically in the manuscripts of Matthew so that we can kind of say, you know what, we have a good handle on what Matthew actually says and there isn't this diversity of reports. And the final one would be the manuscript's honesty or plausibility, that the manuscript is actually saying things that can be believed. Now, let me give you some examples by contrast. Consider this, that we have historically accurate accounts coming from the Gospels, and contrast that with maybe what would be fantasy. Very different approach. Or how about historical fiction? You may have read a book before that was setting forth what would have happened if the Nazis would have won World War II, or what would have happened if the South had won the Civil War. Now, it's an interesting read, but you know from the word go that it is not historically true. They may be trying to run with the historical setting and kind of play out, here's how we think things would have happened, but we all know that isn't what actually happened. So this is not historical fiction. It's actually grappling with, if you will, plausible things that we have good reason to say actually happened. You could also contrast this with the Da Vinci Code. Now, if you read that book when it was selling like hotcakes nearly 15 years ago, you may remember that it set itself forth as building off of a number of historical truths. But the reality is, if you have a handle on the actual history, it was building off of historical fallacies that not only did they have no historical foundation, but actually they were running against all of our historical evidence. And so this is, again, getting back to, does the manuscript have plausibility that it's actually in line with what we know to be historically true? The Da Vinci Code was not that way. the biblical account actually does have that kind of plausibility. Now, here's where some people will say that it is not plausible, is because it records things that they would say are impossible to have happened. You get a record of miraculous healing, or hey, you have a record of somebody rising from the dead, and some will dismiss that as it cannot happen because they have an a priori assumption that such things cannot happen. Now, that's a real issue we have to grapple with, and that's really going to be next session that we get into that. But let's actually start walking through these four major criteria we want to look at for the reliability of historical witnesses. Now, the first one would be our first-hand witnesses. So this gets into how do we date the text. It's interesting, historically, there have been many who have tried to argue that the biblical text, and here let's get specifically to the New Testament, and especially the four accounts of the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that all of those were written long after the events and weren't even written in the first century. They had to be written later in time, and therefore they aren't really reliable. The interesting thing is, as critics have held to that, they have had to push their supposed date of the writing of each of those accounts earlier and earlier in time, closer and closer to the events, because we get more and more discovery of various documents and such. But there's also some other things, even beyond the age of the documents that we have. Let's consider a few other arguments. And the first one that I'll bring up was something that was put forth by John A.T. Robinson in his book, Redating the New Testament. Now, he is not unique in actually coming up with this argument, but he got the most press because he kind of put it forth in a very well-reasoned book. But his argument goes this way. He says that if you read through the accounts of the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you find Jesus predicting the fall of Jerusalem that took place in AD 70. Now, the thing that you don't find in any of those accounts is that none of the accounts ever say, as Jesus is predicting this, and this came to pass when the Romans came in and leveled the city of Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, etc., which is exactly what you would expect. That would be in keeping with the regular way in which the Bible speaks, is that when you're recording a prophecy, but then you're writing about it after the fulfillment of that prophecy, you then say, and this was fulfilled when, but that never happened. So Robinson makes this strong argument that the entirety of the New Testament was written before the year AD 70, because never in the account of the New Testament do you have a reference to the fulfillment of that prophecy by Jesus. Now, another place that you can turn is to Papias. Papias was an early church father, born around the year AD 60, so born in the first century, middle of the first century AD. He lived until roughly the year 130. And so therefore lived into the early part of the second century. So really his writings that come down to us are from that early second century. And he tells us a lot about the dating that takes place for all these individuals. And furthermore, he tells us, we are told by Irenaeus, that Papias even knew John. Now, if you're familiar with Irenaeus, he was, if you will, of John's pedigree, the gospel writer who wrote the Gospel according to St. John, wrote 3 letters, wrote the book of Revelation. John, one of his chief students, was Polycarp, and one of Polycarp's chief students was Irenaeus. And Irenaeus tells us, well, Papias actually knew John, which would make sense. Their lives would have overlapped. Papias would have been a young man. John would have been an old man when their lives crossed paths. But Papias attests to us from the early second century about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, how each one wrote their gospel account and the general time frame. So here is, of course, he's a sympathetic witness, but again, here is actual testimony that already in the early second century that these accounts of the gospel were known to have existed and were being talked about as having been around for quite some time, which again pushes the authorship, the dating of the authorship of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John earlier in time. You could also listen to Saint Ignatius. He died around the year AD 115, so very early in the 2nd century. And he quotes from Matthew's account of the gospel, which once again illustrates, if he's quoting from Matthew, it makes it very clear that Matthew's account of the gospel has been around prior to that date. So again, pushing the date of its composition earlier and earlier. One more example would be this. You're familiar probably with Nero, who we often say how he fiddled while Rome burned. And you may also be familiar with how Nero used it as an opportunity to get the blame off of himself and instead put it upon the Christians. And he does that. But it's interesting that in the book of Acts, which records all this stuff that is going on in the early church, it never mentions Nero and the burning of Rome and blaming the Christians and things like that, which would be something you would expect Luke to record in his account of the book of Acts. It would make perfect sense, but he doesn't record it because, again, what that would suggest is that he wrote the book of Acts prior to the burning in Rome and Nero's persecution, which you can date to roughly AD 64. And since Luke's account of the gospel was written first and then the book of Acts, and there's good evidence for that, just about how one text flows into the other and such. First you get Luke's account of the gospel, then the book of Acts. That would therefore mean, well, Luke was writing his account of the gospel well before the year AD 64. So in other words, it is very reasonable to date the text of our 4 gospel accounts very early, close to the actual events, so that it makes sense that they would actually be written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, therefore be historically reliable, and therefore also be well worth listening to. All right. Let's also talk about the manuscript integrity. And with the manuscript integrity, let's take a look at some of the other ancient writings that are out there. And what I would like to take a look at is how we have various ancient authors who also come forth. And I'm going to put some of them up there. These are actually different examples of ancient manuscripts that we have that are manuscripts of the New Testament. And so the 4 that I put up here, I'm going to describe for you, and these are different papyri. So in the early centuries, the Christian texts were typically written down on papyrus. Now, the challenge with papyrus is it's not going to typically last very long, which is why they developed scribal practices to copy and recopy the text. But we are blessed that some have survived, and I give you 4 examples there. Now, by the way, as you look at all the manuscripts that are out there of the New Testament, we have now over 5,800 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. And you put them all together, you have an astounding 2.6 million pages of biblical text in Greek. Now you can add to that all the early translations, so that the New Testament was written in Greek, but it was quickly translated into other languages so that the word could go to other people. So we have copies into Latin, be used in Rome and other parts of the Roman Empire. Coptic, so that'd be used down into Egypt. Syriac, Armenian, and down the line. So you have even more copies out there. Now, one of the oldest ones and that we have is P90, and it's dated to the 2nd century. So it gives us a little bit, it has a snippet of the Gospel according to St. John. There's also P104. So notice all these are labeled P and then a number. P just stands for papyrus because they're all made from papyrus. And the number is just a classification system. And so P104 contains material from Matthew chapter 21. And again, it also dates to the year, to the 2nd century AD. You can also go with papyrus P98. It has part of the first chapter of the book of Revelation, and it was found to be dated back also to the 2nd century. You can go to what is arguably the most famous of all the papyri, and that would be P52. P52. It gives us information from John chapter 18. And again, it is usually argued that it is the oldest of all the papyri, also from the 2nd century, but earlier than the others. There are other 2nd century manuscripts that are put out there. Now, some of them may be into the 3rd century, but also a good possibility of dating them to the 2nd century. You have papyrus P32, which has Titus, part of Titus in it. There's P46, which goes to the 2nd century, the early 3rd century, and it includes Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, and Hebrews. Now, that's a good example. It doesn't have all of those, the entirety of every one of those books, but it illustrates for us that the letters of Paul, and here Hebrews was also brought in, but that they were kind of put together as a collection. You have P66. The Gospel has selections from the Gospel according to St. John. P77, part of the Gospel of Matthew. P103, also with material from the Gospel according to St. Matthew. And then there is another document. It's not on papyrus. It's what we call a majuscule, and it's labeled GA0189, and it has part of the Acts of the Apostles. And all of those are dated either 2nd century or into the early 3rd century. What it points out is we have this integrity for the manuscripts because you have such a high volume of manuscripts, and so many of them are dated pretty close to the actual writing of the text. So these are copies of the original text, but it's amazing how close it is in time to when those texts were actually put forth. Let's also talk about some corroborating testimony. Corroborating testimony, you might think about how we have the different accounts of the gospel. You have, for example, Matthew's account of the gospel, and he has a unique slant that he brings in there, and we have a good explanation. Papias attests to this as to why this is, but also Matthew himself, he wrote primarily for a Hebrew or Jewish audience. And you can see that in how he writes. And so there are certain details that he will include that are left out of others. You get something similar. You have Mark. What Papias lets us know is that Mark is basically Peter's right-hand man when Peter is the head of the church in Rome. And so he takes what Peter is teaching and he sets it down so that it's recorded for everyone. And therefore, you have Peter's teaching. So you have slightly different take on things in Mark's account. Mark, for example, gives us little details you don't find in the others, such as when Jesus is arrested in the garden, there's a young man there whom the authorities grab him by his cloak and he flees away, unclothed, naked. It's possible that was Mark himself, but we can't say for certain. Then you have Luke, of course. And the thing we know about Luke is not an eyewitness of the events. And so he tells us that he goes to all those who were eyewitnesses when he is compiling his account of the gospel. He interviews them and he sets down an orderly account of what actually happened. And because he went to those eyewitnesses, he gives us information that you don't find in any of the others. For example, he is the one that gives us more information about the pregnancy, birth of Jesus, or the pregnancy of Mary with Jesus, the birth of Jesus, and then even the childhood of Jesus that we don't get in anybody else, likely because one of his key eyewitnesses that he used was Mary, the mother of our Lord. You also get unique information from Luke that he has a great passion for, is recording how Jesus reaches out to those who are ostracized and pushed away by others in society and how Jesus brings them in. Now, the other accounts definitely have that regarding Christ, but Luke gives special attention to that. So he gives us information, accounts that you don't find anywhere else, such as, you may recall, Zacchaeus. Only Luke gives that to us. You might also recall the account of 10 lepers that Jesus heals. That's unique to Luke. And there's more as well. And finally, of course, we have the Gospel according to St. John. John gives a very unique slant as well, that he gives in many ways what is often described as the heavenly view of the gospel, of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So it's a very dramatic depiction. You could also say Mark has a very dramatic depiction. He's kind of got the earthly dramatic view, whereas John has the heavenly dramatic view. But again, the point is this. You have 4 different accounts. They don't conflict with each other. They have some slight differences in how they take specific events, but those are all things that can be reconciled with each other and understood as actually describing the same thing. So they are complementary, but there's not collusion going on because they give their own unique slant along the way. Now, let's talk a little bit more again about manuscript integrity. I mentioned that before, about how you have such great strength of the witnesses for the manuscripts of the New Testament. Remember, the number's 5,800, over 5,800 manuscripts, Greek manuscripts alone of the New Testament. Now, what about other ancient writings? And I'm going to go to, we could use any number of different ones, but I'm going to use writings that are relatively coterminous, relatively from the same time as the writing of the New Testament. So the first one I'll bring up is Tacitus. You see there, he was a Roman historian. He wrote his histories around the year AD 100, so just a little bit after the writing of the New Testament. And here's the thing, our earliest copies of Tacitus's writing is from the year AD 1100. So it's separated by 1,000 years from when he actually wrote it to our earliest surviving manuscript of his writings. And we only have roughly 20 copies that have survived to the present time. Now contrast that with the biblical account, as we were mentioned before, with the Gospels. We have manuscripts that are within roughly 100 years of the actual writing of the document, that these copies have survived, that were only copied down 100 years later, and we have not 20, but thousands of them in place. Here's another example. We can talk about Pliny the Younger. You may remember I mentioned him in our first session. He wrote a significant history for the Roman Empire. He lived in the years AD 61 to AD 113. So again, his chief writings would have been right around the turn of the century there, around the year AD 100. And the earliest copy that we have of his histories is from AD 850. So again, a span of 750 years, and only 7 copies have survived to this point. Again, a stark contrast between the biblical manuscripts, or especially, again, the manuscripts of the gospel accounts. Another one we could take a look at is Suetonius. Suetonius is most known for the Lives of the Caesars. That was one of his chief works. He lived AD 75 to AD 160. So we put his writing at right in the middle of the 2nd century. And the earliest copy that we have that has survived to today is from AD 950. So really a separation of 800 years from when it was composed to our earliest surviving manuscript. And we only have 8 manuscripts that still survive to today. The point is simply this, that the writings of these individuals are generally accepted as accurate, as good historical evidence. In fact, if we didn't go with Tacitus and Pliny and Suetonius, we would have some major gaps in our historical knowledge of the Roman Empire. But they are considered good historical witnesses, and furthermore, they are considered, the copies that survive to today are considered accurate even though they are so few in number, as few as 7 or as many as 20, depending on which individual we're talking about, and even though they're separated anywhere from 750 to 1,000 years from the actual writing, the original writing of the document. So those are considered substantial and noteworthy and trustworthy. How much more, therefore, is the New Testament manuscript having true integrity, especially the accounts of the gospel? Doesn't even hold a candle. The secular individuals such as Pliny and Suetonius and such don't hold a candle to the strength we have of the biblical case. Now, one more I'll put up there, and this is a look at Codex Sinaiticus. So we have our earliest surviving complete manuscripts of the New Testament, where you have the entirety of the manuscript kind of bound together in what you and I would kind of recognize as a book. It's what they would call a codex, come from both the roughly around the middle of the 4th century. So you're talking about a 300-year separation. So that's actually, compared to, again, Pliny and Suetonius and such, a much shorter time period by far, and it's a complete manuscript, and those two, again, have a great deal of agreement with each other. Now, one more thing we should bring into this discussion is the matter of what about the differences between all those manuscripts. After all, if you have 5,800 manuscripts, aren't there a lot of differences? Or sometimes I'll hear it put this way. You know, the Bible has been translated so many times from Greek into English, then English to this other language. You don't know what it actually originally said. Now, on one hand, that is not terribly accurate, because the work of translators is they work from actually the original text. They don't jump through various other languages. Second of all, is just how incredibly reliable our manuscripts are, that we have such little deviation amongst those 5,800 manuscripts. That this is the realm of what we call textual criticism, when you may have two ancient manuscripts that have slightly differing wording for a specific verse of the Bible. And you have to ask yourself, well, which one do I think was the original text? You know, what did Matthew actually write, or what did John actually write? And we have a process that we'll kind of work through to try to arrive at a conclusion. The interesting thing is this, is there may be some pretty interesting differences, but those differences are not ones that actually change the storyline. They are not changes that actually impact Christian teaching and doctrine significantly. These are all little subtle differences. Sometimes it's a matter of the copyist accidentally skipped over a line because I guess it was late in the day and his mind was getting a little tired, and he just accidentally skipped over something. Other times there is reduplication because, again, scribes make mistakes and such. Other times it can be just a slight misspelling. Other times it's a change in word order. None of these, again, really change the meaning, and most of them are rather easily explained. And again, none of them really change the teaching of the text. It's not as if one text says Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary, and then the next text has a slightly different take, or a very different take, that would say that Mary and Joseph could not keep themselves under control until they were actually married, and so she was pregnant and such. No, there's a consistent teaching regarding the person of Christ, what he did, etc. All of them hold to his death and resurrection, etc. So the manuscript integrity, again, is actually rather overwhelming, because those scribal mistakes and changes don't actually have a significant impact upon what the text is actually saying. Now, the next thing we should deal with is the manuscript honesty. So, does the manuscript give an honest depiction? And here's the way that I will approach it is, and this is very reminiscent to what we dealt with in our first session, is that, again, the manuscript gives us real places, and therefore it makes it a very plausible manuscript. So here I have a very famous rendering of Jesus on the road to Emmaus with two disciples. And for the longest time, we really didn't know exactly where Emmaus was. We had an idea of where it should be because we know it was how long of a walk it was from Jerusalem to get there, but we couldn't with certainty identify here has to be where Emmaus actually is. But in 2019, so just last year, Israel Finkelstein, who is a archaeologist there in Israel, he actually happens to be what you'd call a biblical minimalist and a critic of Scripture, that he doesn't actually think it's very accurate. But nevertheless, he identified a specific site known as Kiriath Yearim as the Emmaus that you and I know of from Luke's account of the gospel, Luke 24. And he did that identification based off some Hellenistic era fortifications that have been excavated and such. The point is simply this: when the biblical text, and again, for our purposes, the gospel accounts, when they talk about places, these are actual places. They aren't made up. They're not fantastic. And we can actually identify, oh, this is where they say this is taking place. If you follow the archaeological news, we get more and more coming out of Galilee where sites are now being identified to say, oh, that must be where Peter's hometown was, where Jesus would have first called Peter, etc. And they can make different identifications along the way. Another example would be, again, the manuscript is honest and can be trusted. It has plausibility because it talks about real people. And here I'll mention Caiaphas. Now, again, our first session, I mentioned Caiaphas is recorded by Josephus as actually existing. So we have external to the Bible, an unsympathetic witness, if you will, who isn't on the same page as Holy Scripture, who attests that Caiaphas actually existed. And so here we have some steps that are leading up to the part of Jerusalem where you would have expected the house of Caiaphas, where Jesus would have been kept in kind of under guard early on Good Friday when he had first been arrested and such. But again, Caiaphas is a real person. This is again getting back to the plausibility of the biblical text. Or also you can talk about it has very plausible explanation of events. Here you have kind of the setting of the Passover and where they would have reclined at table and such. But again, the point is this: the way the Gospels describe what happened at the Passover, not only with the crowds coming into Jerusalem, but their celebration of the Passover, but not only the Passover, but other events as well, actually fall in line with what we know to be true about how life was lived in the first century. The manuscript is very plausible in its description of people, places, and events. It's in keeping with what you would expect in the first century. But that leaves open this question. What about those who say, well, the manuscripts aren't reliable, they aren't plausible when they talk about miraculous things happening? We know that people don't rise from the dead. We know that you can't feed 5,000 people with such a meager amount of food. Well, how do we grapple with those very questions that would be used to try to undermine the validity, the reliability of the text? That's going to be our big topic for next time. Until then, I'm going to encourage you to keep taking a look at the videos that I mentioned early on, and also to let me know if you have questions and comments. Love to integrate those into our future sessions. But next time, let's get into how do we understand the miraculous elements and why those do not undermine the veracity of the text, but rather the veracity of the text buttresses that these events actually took place. I pray the Lord's blessings upon you in the coming days and look forward to being with you again. The Lord be with you.